All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the EDI Catalyst, where we will explore topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigeneity in STEM. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Albright, and I'm excited to share with you this new initiative spearheaded by the C2MCI. Here at C2MCI, we're committed to advancing EDI in STEM fields by fostering a culture of respect, inclusion, and excellence among our researchers, students, and partners. In this podcast series, we will feature special guests from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, discussing their lived experiences, as well as providing some resources and tips on how to create more inclusive and equitable environments. Through this, we hope to inspire you to become a catalyst for change in your own communities and workplaces. Just a few quick notes before we start. As usual, there will be time at the end of the session for any members of our live audience to ask questions, so please remain muted until then. You can also put any questions or comments in the chat as well. For today's talk, we're going to be exploring intercultural leadership, and I'm honored and excited to have Jyoti Kotecha here with us, who's the Managing Director of C2MCI, and Kandice Baptiste, who is the Senior Director of Student Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Division of Student Affairs here at Queen's University. So welcome, Kandice and Jyoti. How are you both doing today?
Pretty good so far. Thanks for having me.
I'm good, thanks.
Yeah, it looks like we have some nice weather today. The clouds might be clearing after a few rainy days here in Kingston, so it's great to have you guys on. So let's start out. We always start the podcast by kind of you guys introducing yourselves a little more. So can you tell us, maybe we'll start with Kandice, a little bit about who you are and your current journey and how you got to where your current role.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Kandice Baptiste, as you said. I use she, her pronouns. I come from Tyonega Mohawk territory, so just about 40 minutes, away from Kingston. I was born and raised there, and I currently am the Senior Director of Student Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging here at Queen's in the Division of Student Affairs. And previous to that, I was the Director of the Four Directions Indigenous Student Center, and I was the associate director in the Office of Indigenous Initiatives. So my entire career has been in Indigenous student services and Indigenous initiatives at Ontario universities. And in my current role, I do equity work on behalf of the entire Division of Student Affairs, and am working to support the 5 centers that support equity deserving students on campus. So 4D, Quick, which is Queen's University International Center, Faith and Spiritual Life, Banry, and Yellow House for student equity and inclusion. So this is a brand new role to the DSA, and I'm still kind of figuring it out as I go, but I look forward to bringing together diverse perspectives and doing equity work from an intersectional lens.
Nice. Thanks, Kandice. Can I ask too? So you've been in different roles at Queen's up to this point. What kind of like led you to this kind of career path? Because I think it's an interesting being on like the inclusion and equity side, like administrative kind of roles at the university. I'm interested to know like how you got to that point.
Well, luck, frankly. Like I said, I was a kid from the reserve kind of thing, and I wasn't, I didn't grow up thinking that I'd work at a university. I actually was a basketball player, and that's the only reason I went to university, was to keep playing basketball. And so I went to Wilfrid Laurier University, and at the time when I was a student, there was no a 4D equivalent. There was no Indigenous Student Services, and so I was a varsity athlete, and I did that. And then when my body got too tired of playing basketball, I didn't play my 5th year of eligibility out, and I started an Indigenous student club, like an association kind of thing. And at the time, the university had received some funding to start an Indigenous student center, and I just kind of fell into it that way. I worked with folks who would be in the Division of Student Affairs at Laurier as a kind of student voice. And yeah, I just really enjoyed providing community. I didn't know that, I don't know, I just kind of went to university thinking that my indigeneity was something I had to leave behind, and that I figured I was the only Indigenous student on campus. And so when I started the club, and when we started providing the services, and you realize that there was a lot of Indigenous students, and we were all just didn't know, there was no way to connect with each other. And so I think it was those that early on type of work that made me think that I could actually take what I had been told as a kid to be mindful of our and advance our community's needs, and to make it a career. And so I kind of I was recruiting once I graduated. I was a recruiter for Indigenous students at Laurier for a little while, and then I have just kind of always followed my nose, I guess, as things have come up, and as I've been ready for the next opportunity. And then when the job here at Queen's came up at 4D, I wanted to move closer to home, and to do this work in my own territory. I thought that it was kind of the only ethical way that I could do it, was to do this work in my own community, my own territory. So yeah, it's just kind of how I've done it at Queen's. The same thing, as things have come up, I've sought to find ways in which I can contribute to creating a campus in which I would feel proud of. And so I've just kind of done that work and let those kind of core principles guide me in those decisions.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. I really like hearing your journey, and it's kind of interesting to hear you are one of the pioneers in creating these types of communities. And I think it's really important. These types of communities, I think, are really beneficial to students and people. So I think it's really important. And I'm really proud of Queens. We have a lot of different clubs for people of all diverse backgrounds. So I think it's really great. Um, I had another comment there, but it might come back to me. But thank you for sharing that. Oh, I remember now. It was the point of, I think it's really important that your journey, you don't always have to know what your end goal is. You can follow what you believe and what you're passionate about at the time and continue your journey. And I think that's important for a lot of our students and postdocs who are in that early stages of their career. An important message that you don't always need to have it all figured out right away. Just take it one step at a time.
Yeah,
Okay.
totally.
Perfect. So I'll switch over to Jyoti now. Can you share a little bit about your journey and how you got to your role?
Sure. So I started back in the UK. So for those of you who haven't spoken to me before at the Institute, I was actually born in Africa, and I moved to the UK like many of us did because of political unrest in Africa. We moved to the UK when I was 3. So it was one of those first generations, right, from Africa who have an Indian heritage, especially in the region of London where we were at that time. So I moved there, a huge culture shock, but I was young, so I was able to really adapt to that piece. It was a huge struggle in terms of cultural upbringing and the way that I had to integrate into the school system, because my family was very traditional Indian, where the girl is supposed to be reserved, not speak, and that's not how you shine in UK or the North American culture. So a lot of clash of cultures through my school years. In fact, went to a whole girls school, which is part of my cultural background. They didn't want me to go to a mixed school and mix with males. So again, when you think about success, especially in STEMs, and you have to network, that's a huge cultural barrier that you have to overcome. Anyway, while in high school, I was really fortunate. My chemistry teacher, I think, like most of us, you have that one teacher who really sparks your interest. So for me, it was my chemistry teacher, equivalent of high school, that really sparked my interest in chemistry, really believed in me, and really supported and mentored me through that whole process. I would never actually have considered going to higher education post school. It wasn't the norm thing in my family, my cultural background. We were all supposed to go into business, run a corner store or something like that. So I was the first person actually wanting to go into higher education within our family unit and larger family unit. So that really helped. And back in the UK, they used to have this support program where you didn't have to go to university, but you could actually work, and your employers will support you to do your undergraduate and then your graduate degrees and things like that. So I was very fortunate, coming from a I would say, a poverty kind of background. Being able to go to university full time was not an option for me. So I worked all the way through, and my employers actually supported me in getting my undergraduate degree, which was in chemistry. One of my goals was to work for the analytical government chemist back in the UK, which was the body if you wanted to be an analytical chemist. So I was fortunate. I reached that goal. And I would say for the first 28 years before I moved to Canada, I was a practicing analytical chemist running a laboratory for the government chemist there, which was looking at chemical composition of foods and drugs and making sure that they complied with regulations. Moved to Canada, Kingston, very small town, no job. So I actually had to retrain. I ended up being a technician, from running a big lab for the government chemist, washing test tubes again. Very disheartening at age of 28, 29, 30. So I decided to retrain. I ended up actually taking a little time off to be with my son and raise him. But during that time, I started my master's in public administration at Queen's, which is more of a managerial piece. I came back, I worked for international clinical trials while I was completing my master's. And that was really a wonderful insight because part of my role of being an analytical chemist has always been public good. So when I worked for the government chemist, it was about public good. So doing analytical, clinical trials for cancer was a way to really support healthcare. And so I managed to complete my master's in public administration, which was health-based and really about working in the university structure, the academic structure. After having completed that, I was brought on to support the Center of Studies in Primary Care as their assistant director. I helped build that in a center for about 10, 12 years. I was a lecturer there because the residents have to learn how to read evidence, right? So literature. So one of the things is teaching clinicians about research methodology when they're reading that paper. So that was part of my role as well as building that research institute. Having done that for 12 years, the associate dean in student affairs was part of my master's public administration project. She said, "Hey, Jyoti, what about a move into student support?" And I wasn't quite ready. But anyway, things lined up a year later, and I did join the international, support unit. And that's how I met Kandice when she joined. We were both part of that division for a while together. That was really away from my research desire and what I really wanted to do. But what it taught me was that my life skills really helped in terms of what I think changing the way that we supported international students. And I was able to really contribute on intercultural awareness training. So I looked at the curriculum that we had at the time. And one of the things I wanted to do was to modernize it a little bit because it was very, how would you say that, Candice? It was very colonial, right? It was from, we're going to teach you how to do it right to succeed rather than embracing the culture that people bring in and helping them build that. But also I wanted to make sure that the Indigenous piece was put into that intercultural awareness certificate. So we worked with 4D to really combine that certificate program. So with that couple of years there, came back to research, ran the Beatty Water Center. So when I met Dr. Crudden, then she got this beautiful grant, which really brought in the three aspects of my training: chemistry, health science, which is cancer, and then administration. So I was really fortunate to come here. And I'm really enjoying being able to do that in my role. So there you go. It's very varied, but it all came together.
Yeah, I think you have a very diverse background, and I think you're well suited for this topic today because you've been experienced many different cultures throughout your career in life. I think that's really interesting. I wanted to comment on the point you said about attending an all-girls school. I can imagine doing that for most of and then transitioning to university would have been a tr struggle because there's often, or it's known that there's always a power struggle between the gender and the gender bias that's present. So I can imagine that would have been a huge limitation in a way, never really having experience getting to speak. Not that you never got to speak to male, but I could see how that would be different if you were always exposed to only female.
it was a huge struggle. It's not just the school environment, but it was the cultural background. So in my
Mm,
family, we had my grandparents living with us, which were very traditional. My parents were a bit more liberal, but it was also this case that even if we had male cousins, I wasn't really allowed to be alone in the same room. So moving in to not only university, but the work environment was a struggle,
mm,
right? Because you can't be meek and quiet if you want to, progress. You've got to put your point across, articulate that in a mixed group. So it's a lot of huge struggle. And I think when we're advising students, even within the C2 MCI, you've got to network. I think we have to take a seat back and really think about those cultural norms and be able to support them to do well. And think about some of those barriers that, if you're not brought up in that sort of a culture, you don't think about that, right? So, I mean, I've been fortunate. I've had a lot of great mentors, friends, and supporters outside of the institution that really helped me. And that's one piece of advice that I'd really like to give our team or, you know, folks with different cultures coming in is find your mentors, find your champions, and let them help you. They don't have to be part of your work environment, it can be outside of your work environment, but just reach out.
mm. Yeah, so now I kind of want to move us into, we've kind of touched on about the intercultural piece about where your guys' culture, but maybe can you guys clear up a little bit about what is intercultural awareness even mean, or what does intercultural communications or conflict? I think those are a lot of keywords that people might hear, but not always necessarily know exactly what people are talking about.
Okay. So for me, I guess when you think about cultural awareness, it's not just the fact thinking, oh, the language is different. That's number one, right? That's very, so if you just think about somebody whose first language is French, right? And you're trying to get them to translate. So the structure of that sentence is very different. So when they're doing a presentation, they're going to need a little bit more support, a little bit more time and understanding from us, right? That they're thinking in a different language, translating that in English, that might actually be their third language because they speak a different language at home. So language is one, but it's also the cultural background, the way of acting, the way of being, the way of interacting and communicating. So for an example, if you take the work environment structure, as I said, I was brought up in the UK, but the UK culture is so different from Canadian culture. So in university or in workforce, I would call my boss professor or Mr. And when I came to Canada and my first job was at Queen's, I kept calling my professor, my employer, Dr. Walters, and everyone just looked at me. Why aren't you calling that professor by their first name? So these are the little cultural differences, right? It doesn't just have to be, because you're from a different religion or a different culture that, you got to think about those. It's even in a predominantly English speaking country and you're moving to another predominant English speaking, there are those cultural differences. And I think what cultural awareness training or certificates, these training sessions do is to try and, open your eyes a little bit more, that they're subtle, right? You could have somebody that looks like you, has the same skin color, but their upbringing and culture is so different. And even if you think about awareness, it's not just culturally that they're different or they come from a different background. It's also a difference between your work environments, right? So anyone that's done that socio-ecological model, cultural awareness helps you adapt between different work environments as well. So it's a bit of everything. It's not just about your makeup being different from somebody else. At least that's what it means to me. So over to you, Kandice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, one of the things that well, it's my understanding, so it was taught is that, that we bring everybody along and that we honor everyone's gifts. And that I think that that's really important to kind of ground in people in understanding that difference is fine, more than fine, and so I think that it might be uncomfortable for folks to try and navigate, but I think that starting from a place of having an open mind is critical. I think what it means, intercultural communication means to me is that you meet people where they're at, and that you work through understanding their lived realities. I think it's incumbent on folks who are part of a privileged or dominant group to understand the things that are taken for granted, that are just kind of normalized here in kind of North American society, to understand what we might be bringing as well to these things. And so that we can create an environment and a communication that style that feels like everybody can be a part of it and engage with it. I think that it's really important, again, and incumbent on us as a university to think about the students in our classrooms or that come into our student centers, and think about how we can better reflect folks' lived reality. And so I think part of that is having and being open to multiple communication styles, so that students feel like they can kind of bring themselves entirely to their workplace, whether they're like a work study student or to the classroom or to campus.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. I think you both hit all the key points of what I think about it. I just want to comment too. There is a really good course through the Queen's International Center on intercultural awareness. Anyone who's at Queen's, if you're interested, I highly recommend. But I just wanted to add to this too, that one of the things that I learned when I took that course is it was really focused on your own culture and what your culture is, and then how you behave in front of people. I think that's a key point to comment too. It's always, we're kind of talking about being aware of other people's culture, but you also have to be aware of your culture and maybe reflect on situations and think, did I react that way because of my upbringing or because of my experiences? So I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe we can kind of touch on, so what do you kind of, have you guys, can you comment on some of the um, intercultural challenges that you either faced or you see students facing currently, and maybe what we can do to help reduce those barriers for the teams?
I think one of the things that you said, I want to put a fine point on, Emily, is about the humility that's required, I think, to
Mm,
do this work. I think we all grew up in specific contexts and specific times and places that create biases and blocks for us. And so I think that a critical part of doing this work is having humility to know that you don't know it all, or that you're not perfect, and that just because you don't know something, or just because somebody is presenting differently than what you're used to, doesn't mean that you're right and they're wrong. It means that it requires us to be self-reflective in doing this work. um, and so I guess to answer your question around how we can support students or colleagues in doing this work, I think that any sort of equity work or intercultural communication work is challenging because it requires people to challenge structures and systems that are, again, in place and are taken for granted, right? And so we're kind of dealing at times with the symptoms of a deep-rooted system or a deep-rooted problem or structure, because oftentimes these spaces weren't created for folks like us to navigate, to be a part of, right? I don't think the kind of people who started Queens assumed that there would be Indigenous students. They didn't assume that there would be trans students or queer students. Like, at the medical school, they definitely didn't assume that there'd be Black students. They specifically did not want that. So I think that we have a history that we must acknowledge and work through to get towards sort of progressing, so that students don't have to run into the same problem over and over and over again. And so I think that it's critical for us to acknowledge, so that people that are doing this work, that students that are navigating these places, don't take it personally. I think one of the things that is really hard, and that mentors, so I appreciated comments around mentorship as well, because I think mentors have helped kind of ground me in understanding that, yeah, that it's a system that I'm up against. It's not that I didn't understand how to navigate the policy or the procedure, or that a student doesn't understand those things. It's that the policy and the procedure is kind of inherently misleading, or and it doesn't take into account that these kind of these communities would be here. And so I think that that's really important, is to not personalize it. It's really hard not to, but I think when we're talking about equity work or intercultural communication, that's been something that I've had to really think about, is that that these are big things. And what is in my scope of influence? Well, my scope of influence is to make the interactions I have with my colleague really positive, because I understand them, or I create a space in my classroom where students feel like they can be themselves, right? And so I think that that would be my advice, is to think about the things that you can actually control, and how can you make that piece more culturally responsive and relevant for the diverse folks that are engaging with the space.
Mm, yes, thanks
Yeah.
for sharing that. Jyoti, did you want to
I,
comment?
you know, I really liked how Candice explained that, and I think that piece about self-reflection is really important. Thinking about your own, what you bring to the table, and your perspective and your biases is really, really important. I want to just give an example, because I think Candice, looking at the time, because we haven't got much time, but I think you articulated that really well. But I'd say for us in the research realm, really, we need to take a step back and think about what we think is normal. And I learned this having made mistakes, and we're all going to make mistakes, but I think you have to admit them along the way to change and become more culturally aware um, of what we think is the norm. So, for example, my first research was back in primary care. We were trying to impact diabetes for, Indigenous, because it's very high rate in that patient population, as they used to say. But our very first meeting with an Indigenous researcher, we set an hour aside for that meeting. We had this beautifully arranged agenda where we put 5 minutes for introduction. The thing is, we didn't realize that part of the story is not just an introduction, it's a story. It's about who you are and what you are. That took 45 minutes, and so you have to really think about what we think is right. Running your research or science agenda in a meeting is not usually the norm. So we have to really reflect and think about who we're connecting with and how that's going to function. So I think that is one piece of an example that I can give you that I learned from my own mistake. So really learn about the cultures that you're interacting with, especially in research. Like if you're going to go out and you're going to be working in a community that doesn't look like you, take that time, learn about the culture, what the norms are, and adjust, because what we do in Canada and North America is not right. There's no right, there's no wrong. And I think as scientists, we want to do things that are going to impact and be transformative. Then we need to think about the cultures in the communities that we're going to serve when you go out and you graduate and you go and work somewhere.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Jyoti. I think STEM in particular is very diverse in the people that are part of it. So I think that's a really important message for our members. So we are getting really close to the end of the time. So I'm going to ask if we have any questions or comments from our live audience. Anyone, now's your time. You can unmute and share if you have any comments, or you can put it in the chat and I can read it out. Okay, well, we can just I can continue on here. So I think you guys kind of touched on this in your last question, but what would your main advice or final thought you want to leave everybody with today? Your final message, or if you want them to take one thing away from today, what do you want that to be?
I think that folks should find a supportive community. And I think that, if you're, especially if you're doing equity work. I think that it's really critical that you find a community that feels reflective and responsive, and that people are going to support you when you do make mistakes, and push you along, and helpful, and be helpful that way, and also be supportive when you're experiencing challenges. So that's always my advice, folks.
Jyoti?
I think I agree with Kandice on that, but I think self-reflection, I think, is key, because to build a supportive environment, I think each one of us needs to think about, when we say, oh, this isn't good, is really to reflect a little bit about where that action is coming from before we make that decision. So self-reflection, and couldn't have put it better than you, Kandice, humility goes a long way in terms of really being a culturally respective environment for us to develop.
Yes, and I think I like, Kandice, when you had said too about having that open-mindedness. So when you're going into a situation, try not to get defensive right away, have an open mind and think about where you're coming from, where the other person's coming from. I think those are key points for everyone to take away. So that does bring us to the end of the time. So I do always like to end. Now, Kandice, I know you're not from a science background, but I do still include this question about what your favorite chemical element or molecule is and why. So I don't know if you thought of one or not, or you can say your favorite, a favorite, I guess, to end on.
I don't know. Is water collect? I don't think
Yes.
probably. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
I'll just go
You're
with
good.
water.
I think water's a great one, actually.
Yeah,
Jyoti?
I do too. Okay, I did warn Emily that mine's very boring. So you know what? I fell in love with chemistry, in the first experiment that this wonderful chemistry teacher did was making those really beautiful blue copper sulfate crystals. So my favorite has to be copper, because it brought me into chemistry. But not only that, I just actually like the copper color. In the UK, the pennies in the UK were made of that copper color, and I just love it. So copper.
I'll say it's not a boring answer. That's a great answer.
Everyone
I think chemistry, any color is fun, and I agree. The copper sulfate is a really pretty
just
blue
love that
color.
blue. See?
Well, thank you both for joining me today, and I'll look forward to the next session, seeing everyone there.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Candice.
Thank you.